On the evening of the 10th of May, 1845, Colonel William Patterson made the short trip from the village of West Point to his small cabin on the Iowa prairie. Around midnight, he was aroused from a deep sleep by someone shouting outside his window. It was Jacob Abel. There had been a robbery at the nearby hamlet of Franklin. The Mennonite preacher Johannes Mueller had been murdered. The two men made their way to West Point to call out the Lee County Sheriff. By daybreak, Sheriff Estes, Colonel Patterson, Abel, and several other men arrived at Mueller's single-room cabin. Colonel Patterson later recalled that most horrible sight. Old man Mueller was found just in front of the door, lying dead, stabbed through the heart by a big Bowie knife, and his bloodless face upturned, looked from his open, glassy eyes with an excited stare like that of a soldier dying in the midst of a charge. A little deep, worn path leading from the house to the smokehouse was filled with his heart's blood, which had flowed into it from the place he had fallen. His son-in-law, Henry Leiza, was severely wounded but was not yet dead. The door, through which there was a fresh bullet hole, was yet spattered with blood. The last shot fired by the murderers passed through that door and striking him under the shoulder blade, penetrating a vital part, causing an internal hemorrhage that eventually led to his death. Witnesses told the small posse that the assailants were Thomas Brown and the Hodges brothers, William and Stephen. Looking around, they found traces of the murders in a ravine near the Everhart place, footprints, and a rimless cap. They followed the tracks to the Devil Creek bottoms. Sheriff Estes and Colonel Patterson, who was now armed with a big horse pistol, went ahead to Montrose, Iowa. There they met up with Edward Bonney, a self-proclaimed private detective and well-known scoundrel. Bonney identified the cap as belonging to William Hodges, who lived across the Mississippi River in Nauvoo, Illinois. Several members of the ever-growing posse borrowed a skiff and rowed across the river. There, with the aid of the Nauvoo City Constable, D.M. Repshire, William and Stephen Hodges were arrested at the home of their brother Amos. Thomas Brown eluded capture and was never brought to justice. All three of the Hodges brothers were taken to the Territorial Prison in Fort Madison, Iowa, for their own protection. Amos Hodges was eventually released, but Stephen and William were indicted for murder. The Hodges claimed to be Mormons. The church claimed they were not. Regardless, there was a great deal of strife in the area at that time between Mormons and non-Mormons. The Mormon prophet Joseph Smith had been killed less than a year earlier by an angry mob at the Hancock County Jail in nearby Carthage, Illinois. The Hodges believed they could not get a fair trial in Lee County and were granted a change of venue to upriver Des Moines County. On May 28th, Sheriff Estes took the two Hodges brothers to Burlington, Iowa on the steam ferry New Purchase. There they were held in the Des Moines County Jail, located on the northwest corner of the North Hill Public Square, now called North Hill Park. 34 days later, they were put to trial in the Old Zion Church, which served as the Des Moines County District Court as well as the Iowa Territorial Capitol. Charles Mason, the Chief Justice of the Iowa Supreme Court, presided. After a 5-day trial, the jury quickly returned a verdict. We, the jury, find the defendants, William Hodges and Stephen Hodges, guilty of murder. The courtroom broke into applause. Though he later expressed concerns over the correctness of the verdict, Judge Mason, with depth and emotion, passed sentence. The murder, which in point of atrocity may almost be said to be unparalleled in the annals of crime. You have invaded the sacred fountains of life, cut off in bloom, and maturity of manhood, two chief supports, drenching their hearth with their life's blood. I hereby order that you be taken from this place to the jail of the County of Des Moines, there to remain until Tuesday, the 15th day of July next. That on that day you will be taken by the proper officer of the county to some convenient place within the same, and there between the hours of 10 o'clock a.m. and 4 o'clock p.m., that you may be hung by the neck until you are dead. And may God have mercy upon you. The Burlington Hawk-Eye gave the following account of the hanging. July 17th, 1845, the execution. The brothers, William and Stephen Hodges, were hung in this town on Tuesday last. From dawn until the time appointed for the execution, the principal avenues to town were crowded with people. The steamer Mermaid brought down a large number from Bloomington. The Shaka Khan, after bringing an immense load from the place whose name she bears, proceeded to Aquaka, from whence she landed at our wharf a crowd from Illinois. In the meantime, one of the steam ferry boats from Fort Madison, the Caroline, came loaded to the guards with passengers. The new purchase, with a large multitude from Nauvoo and places adjacent, arrived too late for the passengers to witness the execution. Long before the time appointed, our streets were literally filled with men, women, and children. At 12 o'clock, the guard, composed of 3 or 4 companies of riflemen under the command of Colonel George Temple, arrived at the jail, and soon after, the prisoners were placed in a wagon which contained their coffins, under the care of the deputy sheriff and his assistants. After all the necessary arrangements were made under the judicious direction of the sheriff, John H. McKinney, Esquire, the procession took up its line of march to the gallows. The band played appropriately solemn tunes during the progress of the march. The procession crossed the square from the jail and down Court to 3rd Street, through 3rd to Jefferson Street, through Jefferson to the place of execution. The place of execution was on the Mount Pleasant Road, immediately west of the town. It was a perfect natural amphitheater. The gallows was in the center of the dell and in full view and immediately contiguous to the thousands of spectators who covered the hills. No movement could be made. Nothing could be said that all could not see and hear. In fact, we cannot conceive of a more appropriate location for such a scene. On their way to the gallows, the prisoners manifested no concern, no anxiety. Had they not been dressed in the habiliments of death, none would have taken them as the candidates for the gallows. The stoicism did not leave them. No change was ever perceptible in their countenance when they came in sight of the gallows, and when they mounted the steps and arrived on the platform, they observed a demeanor which showed that it was their study and their great business to go through the scene without any apparent fearfulness of their fate. Although they succeeded, their very success dried up the fountains of sympathy in the breasts of the spectators, as all felt that such conduct did not become men in their awful situation. The gallows occupied by the sheriff and his deputy, the prisoners and a friend that had just arrived in town, the Reverend Mr. White of the Cumberland Presbyterian, the Reverend Mr. Coleman of the Methodists, the Reverend Bishop Loris of the Catholic, and the Reverend Mr. Hutchinson of the Congregational Churches, together with counsel for the prisoners, Messrs. Mills and Hall. The exercise commenced with the reading of the 51st Psalm by Mr. Coleman. This psalm was read at the request of the prisoners, and we cannot but believe from all their conduct and their refusal to confess their crime to their fellow men that they clung to this psalm and adopted its language as an excuse for their refusal. They may have thought their confessions to their Maker were sufficient, and thus they may have palliated their conscience. After the reading of the psalm, Mr. White gave out the appropriate hymn, "Now in the heat of youthful blood," etc. After the singing, Mr. White offered a most fervent and pertinent prayer, calling upon God to shield youth then present as spectators from temptation and sin, and ending their lives as those before them were about to do. Immediately after the prayer, Stephen Hodges came forward to address the crowd. He was very much agitated. His address was so different from anything we anticipated from a dying man. So much bitterness and maliciousness was exhibited in all he said. His manner became so maniacal that although prepared and in a good situation to take down all that was uttered, we were obliged at all times in utter astonishment to drop our pencil and look at the man. We cannot therefore give more than an outline. He said, "Gentlemen and fellow citizens, I stand before you a dying man about to be launched into eternity. I have not much to say and shall not detain you long. There never was a trial where men were convicted under such slight evidence as was brought against us. We have not been tried as white men ought to have been tried. There was no evidence to convict us. Can the jury look on and see two innocent young men executed as we shall be in a few moments and feel right about it? Can the jury, after giving such a verdict in condemning two innocent young men as we are, one 22 and the other 25 years old, go home to their wives and children and sleep quietly? He then alluded to the evidence and in a sort of special pleading, lawyer-like style, attempted to show that it was inadequate to convict them. He asked why the jury did not believe the witnesses who swore that they were at Nauvoo at the time of the murder, and answered that it was because they were Mormons. He then said there have been many murders committed here. Why were they not found guilty and executed? They were not Mormons. That was the reason. It must have been so. Our counsel told us and the jury that the evidence was not sufficient to convict us. Examine our conduct from our youth up and see if you can prove anything against us. Judge Mason came to us and tried to make us confess, and he told us that the evidence was not sufficient to condemn us, and that if we would confess, he would get us reprieved. He then referred to the manner in which they were taken in Lee County, said that everybody wanted to hang them up without judge or jury, alluded to the activity of the sheriff of Lee County, of the willingness of all to bring timber to erect the gallows, still repeating there was no evidence to convict them, and that it was because they were Mormons they were convicted. To corroborate this, they said the prosecuting attorneys declared they ought to be hung for an example, if not nothing else. Here he became almost frantic and came near, we thought, of bursting asunder the ropes that bound his arms. The froth issued from his mouth, and he gave other signs of extreme rage and madness. He seemed now inclined to include all the spectators in his anathemas, and said the curses of God would rest upon them. He then broke out in a rhapsody of benevolence, and declared that he felt for the bystanders, not for himself. He would die 1,000 deaths if he could bring them back to virtue. He asked how could any citizen go home and tell his wife what he had seen. Two men hung without evidence and sleep quietly. He then said he was prepared to go and stated that the Reverend Mr. White and Coleman had been with him several days, and he thanked them. He said he had been well treated while in prison. If he had been a boarder at Mr. Painter's, the jailer's, he could not have had better fare. He acknowledged that he had received the most tender treatment from Sheriff McKinney, and then with the utmost coolness thanked the audience for their attention and retired. It was our intention, and we believe that thousands felt as we did, to have left the ground or to have turned our back upon the dreadful tragedy as soon as the preliminary exercises were over. But the speech and conduct of Stephen dissipated those tender sympathies in their behalf which we had all along felt. This change was wrought in us by having been in possession of admissions made by both prisoners to different individuals entirely opposite to the statements they made on the gallows. Those admissions clearly proved their guilt. Soon after Stephen took his seat, William Hodges came forward and said, "Friends and fellow citizens, I am on the step that is soon to place me in eternity. I am innocent of shedding man's blood." He then, in a much more subdued spirit than Stephen, reviewed the evidence adduced at his trial, complained of its insufficiency, and declared that it was not strong enough to convict a man in a common case of assault and battery. He became quite animated and addressed the crowd at one time as "gentlemen of the jury." They both seemed to have impressed upon their minds the arguments of their counsel as they were uttered on the trial, and it was these arguments, in some instances clothed in the very language of their counsel, that they urged as a proof of their innocence on the scaffold. He urged all to repent of their sins. He then said, "I am prepared to go, and when I drop, I expect to go right straight into heaven. I bid you all farewell. I'm going home to glory. I die in peace and hope to meet you all in the better world of glory." He claimed the forgiveness of all and said he forgave all, and again bid the audience farewell. Mr. White then said there was still time for religious exercises, and as the prisoners requested the time might be so filled up, they proceeded to sing a few hymns in which all could join. After which, Bishop Loris read the story of the penitent thief and made some very appropriate remarks, admonishing all to serve and fear God and never sin against him, and thus avoid the doom that awaited the young man so soon to be executed. Mr. White gave a recital of the manner in which he became acquainted with prisoners and made some appropriate remarks. Stephen Hodges then made some additional remarks as to the lameness of the evidence which convicted them, thought the evidence against his brother was no evidence at all, and seemed to wish to get up sympathy in their behalf. He then bade all farewell, the audience and his friends in particular. William also made a few additional remarks in bidding a last farewell to the people. Their chains were then knocked off, and the sheriff conducted William to the drop and put the rope around his neck. While the rope was being put around the neck of Stephen, we could see William was apparently engaged in prayer. The caps were pulled over their faces, and in a few moments, the sheriff with one blow severed the cord. The drop fell, and both were launched into eternity. Stephen's neck broke, and he died without a struggle. William struggled nearly 10 minutes before he was apparently dead. Thus ended the scene of their mortal existence. Our hope is that the impression of it in the minds of all will be beneficial, although public executions ordinarily, in our opinion, have a different tendency. Execution should be so conducted as to hold out no inducement for the culprit to make a hero of himself. Are we uncharitable in thinking that the whole conduct of these young men at the gallows and on their way there was to gain for themselves a title of heroes? Are we, after we knew that they had held out encouragement to one of their counsel and to others that they would confess, and that nothing probably but the presence of their sister prevented it? When called upon to fulfill his special engagement to do this, William, who had seen and conversed with Stephen, declared that he could not do it, that if he revealed the secret, the whole family would be murdered. At another time, one of them said that they had taken an oath, and they might as well die with the secret as to break that oath. There must be some horrid secrets at Nauvoo which sets human life and common human allegiance at defiance. Nothing but the revelation of the righteous judgment of heaven can detect and bring to justice men thus bound tighter. Too much praise cannot be awarded to John H. McKinney, Esquire, our sheriff. From the trial to the execution, he exhibited humanity, firmness, and a judicious arrangement of things that could not be outdone. His conduct in this matter merits the support of every man in the county. After the bodies were taken down, they were placed in the coffins and handed over to their friends on board the steam ferry boat New Purchase. His sister accompanied their remains to Nauvoo. The number of people at the execution has been variously estimated. We think there were from 8 to 10,000. Never have we seen more decorum or better behavior exhibited at a public execution, and we have witnessed several in or near Boston. We have heard of no accidents. We understand that several fainted, and we heard a few screams from the females as the drop fell. All seemed to realize that it was an awful and melancholy sight to see two young men who might have been ornaments in society thus cut off in health and in vigor of manhood. And we hope some good impression may have been made. All must have felt that the way of the transgressor is hard. The only wise way is for youth to shun temptation and bad company.